This is Dr. Michael Cameron, and this is the Registered Behavior Technician module number 5. The task list item that this module is connected to is F05, which is Professional Conduct and Scope of Practice. The title of this specific module is Maintaining Client Dignity. The duration, similar to the other modules, is 60 minutes. And as with other modules as well, there'll be a competency-based test and it will consist of 5 questions. I should also note, similar to the last module, that this one also fulfills 1 hour of the ethics requirement. And just to remind you, there'll be a total of 3 hours of ethics instruction in order to qualify to take the comprehensive exam for the Registered Behavior Technician credential. The purpose of this module is to first emphasize the importance of recognizing and honoring the dignity of others with regard for the needs of people, especially those with disabilities, and for focusing on their common good. The second objective is to review your obligations as a mandated reporter. And third, to discuss stewardship. I'll be providing a definition of stewardship and discussing the need to preserve the integrity of our science, which of course is behavior analysis. The fourth objective is to discuss the code of ethics as outlined by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. This will be a continuation of that discussion, since we certainly have already covered a fair amount in the last module. And then finally, to provide an overview of the ethical responsibilities of a registered behavior technician. Those are our 5 goals for the current module. Now, similar to what I've done in other modules, I like to do a bit of an overview. I'll use a bit of a different format this time for our overview of accumulated knowledge. And one of the things that I should point out is that at this juncture, with your 5th module, you've accumulated a pretty substantial amount of knowledge and information already. And I'd like to do a little bit of a review in terms of things that you've acquired in terms of your knowledge to date. And here's our format. It's a Jeopardy format, and we'll get started. So we'll take famous people for 200, and the foremost propagator of normalization in North America. What is Wolf-Wolfensberger? We'll take assessments for 100. An assessment used to evaluate the function of problem behavior. What is a functional behavior assessment? And we'll continue. Let's look at associations for 200. The association responsible for developing the Registered Behavior Technician credential. And of course, what is the Behavior Analyst Certification Board? We'll continue with acronyms for 200. The BACB stands for what is the Behavior Analyst Certification Board? Let's go back to famous people for 100. And the psychologist responsible for the science that serves the foundation of behavior analysis. And of course, what is B.F. Skinner? And then finally, acronyms for 300. RBT stands for what is the Registered Behavior Technician? So we certainly have covered more information than what I'm reviewing here, but here's just a sampling of things that you have already learned. Now, with respect to the first strand that we'll review, behavior analysts and the individual behavior change program is the name of the strand. And one of the first obligations that we have as a behavior analyst is to avoid what's referred to as harmful reinforcers. Now, one of the things that I should point out is that in future modules, we'll be providing the formal definition of what a reinforcer is. You'll receive all the good information regarding the definition from the field of behavior analysis, and we'll be discussing in depth just exactly how to use reinforcers as well. But from an ethical standpoint, we do have an obligation to avoid things that are harmful to an individual. And of course, one category of things that can be harmful would include high sugar content foods or high salt content foods. One of the things that falls into that category, of course, is candy. And one of the things that we want to ensure is that when we're working with individuals and we have reinforcers that are being made available to that person, we want to avoid those things that could be harmful. And of course, foods with high sugar content and an excessive amount of that kind of food could certainly have a detrimental effect on an individual. Now, there are people here going through the Registered Behavior Technician modules that will also be working with adults, not just children. So you may be working with individuals who are beyond the age of 18 or between the ages of 18 and the elderly, quite frankly. And we'll also be working with individuals with a variety of forms of diagnoses. So not just individuals with autism spectrum disorder, but it could be a person with a psychiatric disturbance. It could be a person that is in a geriatric kind of environment. And along with that comes the use of reinforcers that are different from those that we would use with children. So, of course, one thing that falls into that category are tobacco products. That would be an item that if can be avoided in terms of a reinforcer. It can be a product that can have a negative impact, and when possible, we are avoiding the use of arranging such reinforcers for a person. What falls into the third category on the top right of the screen, you certainly recognize that kind of facial expression on a child, and that would be somebody engaged in video games or various kinds of games on handheld devices, whether it be an iPhone or an iPad or a tablet. And arranging for those as reinforcers could also have a negative impact if the duration in which that individual is allowed to engage is prolonged, or if the person is so engaged in technology and gaming and handheld devices with games on them. The duration, if going too long, can essentially isolate the individual and can certainly be negative in terms of the outcome. Another category would be foods with high fat content, high salt content, or just large volumes. So in the lower left-hand corner here, we have fast foods that could have a negative impact from a biological standpoint on an individual. Next, allowing a person, despite the fact that it may be a reinforcer, to engage in high-risk activities in unsafe environments. So for example, using a razor scooter or a skateboard in high-traffic areas. That would be certainly something that would fall into the category of a reinforcer that could have a negative impact for the individual. So high-risk sports or high-risk activities that may function as a reinforcer, however put the person at risk, are things to be avoided. And then the final category would be engaging in activities that may put the person at risk to come in contact with perpetrators. So for example, having free access to chats or Google Talk or FaceTime, for example, without those engagements being monitored, can also have a negative impact on the individual. So by way of overview and summary, high sugar content foods such as candies, tobacco products, excessive use of video gaming, high fat, high salt content foods such as fast foods, high risk sports and activities such as skateboarding or extreme sports, despite the fact that the person may engage in those and find them reinforcing. We have to be careful as board certified behavior analysts and as registered behavior technicians to ensure that we're arranging only those contingencies and reinforcers that that are not harmful to the individual. And then the final category would be technology that puts individuals in contact with people on the internet, for example, that may not be known to the family or to the registered behavior technician. So that is one of our obligations as a registered behavior technician, is to ensure that we're avoiding things that can have a negative impact on the individual that we are serving. This entire module, as I mentioned at the beginning, is about preserving a person's dignity. This is something I have very strong feelings about, and have a lot to say regarding the dignity of others. And to begin that discussion, I will provide you with a quote from Max Dupree, and that is this: "We need to give each other the space to grow, to be ourselves, to exercise our diversity. We need to give each other space so that we may both give and receive such beautiful things such as ideas, openness, dignity, joy, healing, and inclusion." And when we're working with an individual and guiding them, as a registered behavior technician will do, regardless of that person's presentation, the person that we're serving, whether it be a child with autism spectrum disorder, or whether it be an adolescent with a physical disability such as CP, or whether it be an adult with a psychiatric disturbance, one of the most essential things that we can do for that individual in our interactions with them is to give them the space and allow them to preserve their dignity at all times. And we do that in a variety of different ways. We do that through the language that we use when talking with the individual, even the language that we're using when we're describing that individual to other people. That is an area where we can preserve a person's dignity just by the way that we're talking to them and the way that we're talking about them. And that is why during one of the earlier modules, I really spent a lot of time on Wolfenberger's principle of normalization and person-first language as well, because it is critical and it matters in terms of how we talk to an individual and how we talk about them. And let me just point out that for many of you here, going through the Registered Behavior Technician series, you will work with individuals that are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Now, about 50% of those individuals that you will work with may be nonverbal or have some limited verbal capabilities. The other 50% may be highly verbal. They may even fall into the category of being of normal intelligence, if not gifted with very high IQs. But for those individuals that fall in the severe end of on the continuum, these are folks that may not respond to you. They may not have verbal capability. They may not even be using any formalized communication system. Not vocal verbal, not iconic in terms of, or symbolic in terms of communication. They may not be using picture exchange communication system of any kind. And my best advice to you is to never make assumptions about what a person understands. There's been plenty of demonstrations where a nonverbal individual who apparently is not understanding the language that you're using or what you are saying to them, have demonstrated a full capacity to understand everything that you're saying and to be able to process that information. The implication here is that as you are speaking to an individual, regardless of whether they are nonverbal or fully verbal, always maintain dignified language, always make the assumption that they're completely understanding everything that you say, and to speak accordingly to the individual. Now, we also make it a practice to understand the developmental level of the person that we're serving. So if through standardized testing we know that we have a person that we're working with that is functioning at the 3-year-old level, despite the fact that maybe they may be 12 years old or 13 years old, we will use developmentally appropriate language. However, even in using developmentally appropriate language, you can maintain the dignity of a person by using that language appropriately and not speaking below the person's developmental level or not infantilizing an individual, but using appropriate language for that person. So we confer dignity on another person by the way we speak with them. And once again, I know I'm repeating myself here, but it's worth saying over again. Never make assumptions about an individual, whether they're not verbal or whether they are. Do not make assumptions about what they're understanding. And speak with them, speak to them, speak about them when they're in the room, assuming that they're processing and understanding everything that you're saying. I think if we maintain that as a standard, then we find ourselves conferring dignity at all times. The other thing that makes a close connection to maintaining the dignity of another person is connected to the environment that you arrange for them. So when an environment is dignified, the environment is orderly, the environment is clean, the environment is arranged and highly conducive to the person's education and conducive to the person's learning as well. One of the things I'm reminded of as I say this is that early in my career, I worked with many individuals who had physical disabilities as well as developmental disabilities. And many of those people had devices to aid and to assist them in terms of ambulation. Many had walkers, many of them had wheelchairs and other forms of devices that allowed for their mobility. And one of the things that I did consistently was to ensure that their devices were always clean. I took great care in terms of cleaning an individual's wheelchair, cleaning their walkers, cleaning their walking sticks for many individuals that I've worked with that were blind. And it was just my way of communicating not only to them, but also to the people around me that were also serving other individuals, and also to the person's caregivers and parents, that I cared. I cared about their environment enough to ensure that it was clean at all times, that I cared about their environment enough to make sure that it was organized with respect to the educational materials that I was using. It is through the environment that you communicate to others just exactly how much you care about a person. And it is through the environment and the environmental arrangements that you confer dignity on another person. So to recap, the way we talk to people, the way we talk about them, the way we have conversations will allow a person to retain and maintain their dignity. The way that we structure the environments that we're using to support the person will speak volumes about how we feel about that person, and we can preserve their dignity just by being cautious and sensitive in terms of the environments that we arrange. The final category would be caring. Now, for those people going into and through this series of modules to be a registered behavior technician, there are people here that have had experiences and maybe with a parent, your mom or your dad. It could be a grandmother or a grandfather, for example. And somebody here, if not many, have had the experience where your grandmother, your grandfather, your aunt, your uncle became very ill, and they were unable to do those things that they would typically do to care for themselves. So you may have found yourself in a role where you're providing the personal care to the individual. And many of you have taken the time to ensure that if your grandmother was in a hospital or your aunt was in a hospital and they were unable to care for themselves, you have spent time brushing their hair. You have spent time trimming their fingernails or filing their fingernails. And if it was a grandfather or uncle, for example, you may have lathered up their faces and given them a very close shave, and then combed their hair out, and to assist them, or have taken the responsibility yourself to brush their teeth, for example. These are all things that we do to care for another individual. And the reason we do that is because even when a person is there and they're unable to help themselves, perhaps confined to a wheelchair, perhaps confined to a hospital bed, it makes a difference. The way that they appear makes a difference. Your uncle that is clean shaven with his hair combed neatly and with teeth brushed presents himself to the world in a way that is dignified. So many times as a registered behavior technician, you will find yourself in a situation where the person that you're serving needs that kind of support. And the way that we show up in this world and the way we present ourselves in this world really matters. And it will make a difference in terms of how people interact with us as a result of our appearance. So to recap, in order to assist a person in terms of maintaining their dignity, be cautious of the language that you use. I'm going to repeat myself yet again. Even if the person does not have the capacity for language, even though they appear to be nonverbal, never make the assumption that they're not understanding what you're saying, and adjust your language and use appropriate language at all times. Care for their environment. Make sure that their environment is organized, it is tidy, it is neat, it is clean. It could be their immediate environment, which may be their wheelchair, for example, or a walker. Anything that the person's coming in contact or using on a regular basis, it will make a difference if you're caring for that. And then caring for the person through a variety of different ways, not allowing them to show up in the world in a way that they would not want if they were able to care for themselves. Ensuring that they're not soiled in any way, that they are clean, that their faces are clean, that their hands are clean. And again, I'm just going to remind you, for those people here that have been through this process with a grandmother or grandfather or dad or mom or aunt or uncle, you know what it's like to care for them when they are unable to. And we will confer that same respect and we'll have that same standard for those individuals that we serve as registered behavior technicians. This matters. The dignity of a person matters, and that is a few ways of doing that to protect them. Now, in the next category, we will be responsible as registered behavior technicians for upholding and advancing the ethics, values, and the principles that we've learned about. And one way to do that is by participating always in behavior analytic professional and scientific organizations and activities. You essentially, as a registered behavior technician, are an ambassador for the field. As a result of your training, which we take seriously, and I know you will take responsibility for in terms of having this credential. You are an ambassador, you are a representative, you are the voice for the field of behavior analysis, and it will always be important for you to ensure that you're preserving the principles and preserving the reputation and the way that the science and the field of applied behavior analysis is perceived. And one way to do that is by participating continuously in professional and scientific organizations and activities. That's exactly why in the previous module I introduced you to some of these professional associations and organizations. For example, the Association for Behavior Analysis International. Once again, there's an annual conference that comes around in May each year. Also understanding the role of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. That's an organization that you should be very familiar with, and you should spend time on their website and orienting yourself to everything that the board has to offer, and also orienting yourself to what your responsibilities are to the board as a registered behavior technician. So you are an ambassador. You are responsible for upholding our field and the reputation of our field. And as a result of earning your credential, the expectation is that you will contribute to the field in a variety of different ways. The next standard is to promote the ethical culture and to make others aware of the code. When I introduce this concept, one of the things that I'm reminded of is bullying. And the best interventions that I've seen in public schools to address issues centered on bullying. Now, many of you here, as I've mentioned, as a result of being a registered behavior technician, you may work in a public school setting, you may work in a private school setting, you may work in a hospital, you may work in a clinic, you may be working in home-based settings. It's quite diverse in terms of the kind of activity that you folks will be engaged in, and you'll be working in a variety of different environments. For those of you that have worked in schools or will work in schools, if you've had the experience of coming in contact with a program that really does seriously address bullying, then one of the uniform things that you'll find among those programs is that the best ones are those where the student body is taught about bullying, and they're taught to have zero tolerance for bullying. And essentially it is peer-to-peer monitoring of bullying activity that really makes a difference. By peer-to-peer monitoring, I mean that it is one peer that is giving feedback to another. So anybody that may violate the code and begin engaging in bullying activity will find themselves being addressed by the peers around them. And it's the same thing with respect to our requirement in terms of upholding the ethics of what we do as a registered behavior technician. So you will be in a position where you'll have to give feedback to others, and it could be a peer. You may be giving feedback to another registered behavior technician. However, you may be in a position where you have to give feedback to a supervisor, and that supervisor may be a board-certified behavior analyst. And when we're upholding the culture and upholding the ethical code and ensuring that people are honoring the ethical code, you may find yourself in a situation where you are giving a supervisor feedback and not just a peer. And that supervisor may be a master's level board-certified behavior analyst, or the person may be a board-certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. It is your obligation to ensure that the ethical code of conduct is honored and is upheld, and that may require you to have conversations with peers, other registered behavior technicians, or supervisors, BCBAs or BCBAs D. Your other responsibility is to ensure that you understand that in your work you're a mandated reporter. Now each state, and there'll be a variety of states that people live in that are going through this training, each state will have its own guidelines and policies and procedures that you must honor. Specifically request training in this area if you have not been offered training in the area of what your responsibilities are as a mandated reporter, which essentially means that if you see any violation of an individual's human rights, any violation that may occur in a public school or a private school, or even in the home of an individual, you have the responsibility to report that infraction and to ensure that the appropriate organizations are made aware. And it may be a child-based organization, or it may be an adult-based organization. So it's essential that you understand what your responsibilities are as a mandated reporter, who it is that you contact, having that phone number always available. And if it's a child that you're working with, then ensuring that you have the proper phone numbers for children's services, or if it's an adult that you're responsible for serving, then having the phone number for the adult reporting agency that you would need to know about, or if it's an elderly person that you're responsible for serving. Some of you may be working in the field of behavioral gerontology, and you may have contact with individuals that are elderly, so you'd be reporting to elderly affairs. The point here is that the person that is supervising you, the board-certified behavior analyst, or the school that you're working for, or the hospital that you're working for, or the nursing home that you're working for, should provide you with clear instruction in terms of how to report infractions in human rights. And be sure that you have the proper training, and be sure that you have the appropriate phone numbers on hand in the event that you do have to report a violation of an individual's human rights. These are the most uncomfortable situations to be in. It is a very difficult thing to report the actions of a teacher, for example, to report the actions of a mom or a dad, or even a sibling, or to report the actions of nurses if you're working in a hospital or a nursing home situation. It is a very uncomfortable and very difficult thing to do. However, as a mandated reporter, you will have that responsibility. I will say that having a mentor, especially the first time that you have to do something like that, having a mentor guide you through that process is essential. And you'll want to prearrange who that person is in the event that you do have to make a report. Now, I'd like to point out one of the best books I've ever read that has really assisted me as a professional in terms of doing that kind of report, is a book referred to as Crucial Conversations. And the thrust of this book and the main message in this book is that first, we do have to have crucial conversations and uncomfortable conversations with other individuals. However, when you're doing when you're engaged in such a conversation, you have to ensure that you have clarity in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what your intentions are. You have to ensure that you have an openness always and are listening to the perspective of other people, and whenever possible, that the conversation that you're having is one that ends up being one that is beneficial to you and frankly to in the long term to the other individual that you're communicating with. So it's my recommendation to you. You're going through this formal training as a registered behavior technician. The book Crucial Conversations, which happens to be one of the best books I have read, that provides a good foundation in terms of how to have difficult conversations with other people. Highly recommend it to you if you have the opportunity to read. We're also obligated to attempt to resolve conflicts with individuals. So if it's another registered behavior technician, for example, that has committed an ethical violation, or, as I mentioned before, if it happens to be a board-certified behavior analyst or a board-certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level, we do have an obligation to attempt to resolve the conflict. And that could be through spoken communication, it could be through written communication. It can take a variety of different ways. In the event that you're not able to resolve the conflict, then the Behavior Analyst Certification Board has a formal process that you will follow to file a formal complaint against the individual. I highly encourage you to familiarize yourself with the complaint process. One of the things that I'm a firm believer in is that we don't wait until we have to use a system or a structure to familiarize ourselves with the structure. Because you know as well as I do that once we move into a highly emotional state, When things get very difficult for us, it's hardly the time to begin learning something new. So I always encourage the people that I mentor to download the appropriate forms from the Behavioral Analytics Certification website, to familiarize themselves with those forms during non-emotional circumstances, so that when it does come time for you to file a complaint, if ever needed, when it comes time to actually do that, you've got familiarity with the form, you know how to use it, you know what your requirements are, and at that point it's just your obligation to follow through. So priming yourself for that, previewing the information is my best advice to you, because there may be a time where there's another registered behavior technician that you need to have a conversation with, attempt to resolve an ethical conflict with. You may be unable to do so, and you may find yourself having to follow through and file a complaint. Or, as I mentioned, it could be a BCBA that has committed the violation and you need to report. So familiarizing yourself with the information is critically important. Our next obligation has to do with public statements. We avoid making public statements that are false, deceptive, misleading, exaggerated, or fraudulent. One way to do that, in my experience, has been by making claims that are certainly not appropriate or not even feasible. So, for example, telling a family member that may have a 10-year-old child that may be completely nonverbal and may not even have any nonverbal communication in their repertoire. Telling that family that you will be able to get that child to have normal conversation or to have normal conversational exchanges, or to get to the person where they are verbal in a way that's comparable to same-age peers. That could be an exaggeration in terms of what you're able to accomplish. It could be very misleading to the parent with respect to what you're able to accomplish. And we avoid those things always. We are very cautious in terms of what we tell other people about what we're able to achieve. My recommendation to you is you always maintain a level of conservativeness and not to exaggerate at all what you feel you're able to achieve as a registered behavior technician in your work with another individual. The second requirement, and you've heard this one before, you do not implement non-behavior analytic interventions. It is not our role. We are working in the field of behavior analysis. In the field of behavior analysis, we pride ourselves in terms of the scientific and using procedures that have followed and have been demonstrated to be effective through the scientific process. We pride ourselves in using procedures that are referred to as evidence-based practices. There's an entire array and collection of evidence-based practices that you can familiarize yourself with. And one of our essential obligations is that we not use non-behavior analytic interventions, and we do use procedures that have been demonstrated to be evidence-based. And that is our core responsibility as a registered behavior technician. Next, we're very cautious about statements not to other individuals, but by other individuals. Now, in my career, I've done quite a bit of work in terms of being interviewed by radio stations, television stations, by journalists as well. And one of the things I've been fortunate enough to do is to receive a preview of what the person would be publishing. So if it was in print media, for example, I would ask the journalist specifically to allow me to review what was being published subsequent to the interview. And when it has not been a live broadcast, let's say it's been a recorded broadcast for radio or television, for example, I've been able to preview that information as well before it being released to the public. The only time I haven't been able to preview has been it's been a live show on the radio, for example, or a live television broadcast. Then, of course, I'm not able to preview the information prior to being released because it's real time, it's live. Under those circumstances, I'm very careful about the way that the interviewer on television or radio is actually framing the question. I'll just ensure that there's clarity prior to answering it. But all of this relates to what is referred to as stewardship. And that means the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So what we're describing here and what we're discussing here is that the field of behavior analysis, our science, is entrusted to your care. As a result of you going through the modules and becoming a registered behavior technician and receiving that impressive credential, we are entrusting to your care the management of our reputation, the management of the reputation of applied behavior analysis, our science, and one way to preserve the reputation and one way to protect our science in our field is by being very careful what other people say about our field and by correcting individuals when they need to be corrected, or by providing elaboration and clarification when required. So for those of you that may be in a position to be interviewed by journalists, to be on a radio program, for example, or a television program, for example, it is critically important that you maintain this stewardship, that you responsibly manage and protect the field and the reputation of the field of behavior analysis. Next are some standards that we always maintain, and the first one has to do with testimonials and advertising. So one of your requirements is that you will not solicit or use testimonials about behavior analytic services from current clients. So what that means is that you may have a great relationship with a mom or dad. You may have a great relationship with a nurse that you're working with in terms of perhaps a nursing home or a hospital. You may have a great reputation and be somebody that is admired in a school, and you may have a good relationship with the teachers in that school or the administrators in that school. It'd be very easy for you to go forward and to ask a nurse or to ask a teacher or to ask a school administrator to make a comment or a statement about the effectiveness of your services. That would be a prime example of soliciting a testimonial from another individual. And the reason a person would want to solicit a testimonial is because they would want to use that for advertising purposes. So perhaps they're putting that on a website, or perhaps they're taking a quote that somebody said about them and publicizing it on Facebook, or publicizing it within the context of a Twitter communication, and tweeting the specific information. So one of your requirements as a registered behavior technician is to ensure that you never solicit information, quotes, and testimonials about your services or your work, or the work in general of the organization that you are employed by. So you would not be doing it on their behalf as well. The other obligation that you have is to not engage in what is referred to as in-person solicitation. So you're not engaging directly or through any agent in an uninvited solicitation of business. So what that means is, by way of example, is that you would not go into a preschool uninvited, or you would not go into a hospital setting, for example, uninvited, and begin talking to the doctors about the services that your organization is is providing. So perhaps, for example, you're engaged as a registered behavior technician in early intensive behavioral intervention, and you may want to expand the business for the organization that you work for. So in-person, uninvited solicitation would take the form of you going into a hospital setting, you going into a preschool, for example, asking to speak to teachers, or in the hospital setting, asking to speak to doctors, and then telling them about your services and encouraging them to access your services. That would be an example of in-person solicitation, and that is exactly the kind of activity that you need to avoid as a registered behavior technician. It creates conflict, and it is a conflict of interest. Next, as a registered behavior technician, and I hope this happens for you, I hope that there are opportunities for you to engage in research. And I mentioned in a previous module, there can be lots of benefits as a result of engaging in research activity. You get to expand your own skill set, you get to learn many things that you otherwise would not as a result of the research. So your obligation as a registered behavior technician is to plan and conduct research in a manner that's consistent with applicable law and regulations. So for research activity, whenever human subjects are involved, and I imagine for the majority of you, you'll be working exclusively with humans, individuals. There's a process that we need to go through before conducting research, and it's what's referred to as an institutional review board review, also referred to as IRB, Institutional Review Board. That is an independent body of individuals who will assess the risks and the benefits of the research, and that body of individuals will either approve or not approve the research activity. So it's important for you to know that if you're engaged in research, then there are policies and procedures that you need to follow, and regulations and professional standards that you need to honor before engaging in that research activity. And the IRB, Institutional Review Board process, is one such example of something that we need to honor. So it would be your obligation to speak to your supervisor or the person that's invited you to do the research about what your requirements are and what your obligations are. So you'll want to find out about the IRB that is part of the organization that you're working for, or part of the school that you may be working for, or the hospital-based setting that you may be working for. The next standard has to do with accuracy and use of data. This is probably one of your core, most essential responsibilities. And once again, I've said this during previous modules, but I'll repeat it here. As a registered behavior technician, you'll be in the continuous process of collecting data for your supervisor and also for all the stakeholders. The reason for that is because all of the decisions that we make are data-based decisions, and the decisions that we make are only as good as the integrity and the honesty of the data that you're providing individuals. So there's a quote that I like, and it's this: if it's not accurate, it may as well not exist. As a result of providing inaccurate data, we are misleading, and we bring people in the direction where the best decisions are not made, or harmful decisions are made, quite frankly. Your other responsibility is to the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, and it's your responsibility to provide truthful and accurate information and to provide the Behavior Analyst Certification Board with timely responding and reporting. So you'll have a responsibility on an annual basis to renew your credential as a registered behavior technician. If there's name changes, for example, for many of you, or changes of addresses, you will go to the BACB portal, which you'll learn about, and you'll file your name change, you'll file your address change, or you'll file your status change in some way. Or if there are ethical violations that have been committed by you, or if you're investigated or evaluated in some way, you need to familiarize yourself with the BACB standards with respect to your reporting responsibilities along that line as well. And then finally, with respect to our obligations as a registered behavior technician, you need to maintain the confidentiality and the intellectual property of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. And that includes their logos and the use of their logos. And you need to maintain the responsibility of using them responsibly. So once again, this is an area that you should review on the BACB website to make sure that you don't erroneously use their logo or their information, their intellectual property in an inappropriate way. You also have a responsibility for examination honesty and reporting irregularities. So this makes a connection to the exam that you'll take to become a registered behavior technician. You will not be sharing the information on the exam, the questions on the exam, or certainly the answers that you have. You would not be sharing that information with other people going through that track as well. And if some of you move on, and I hope you do, to study to become a board certified behavior analyst, then when you sit for that international examination, that you're not using information from that exam to share with another person. You're not communicating the questions. You're not communicating your answers to the questions. You're preserving the examination and the information about that examination, and that is your responsibility, whether you be a registered behavior technician or a board-certified behavior analyst. You're also maintaining compliance with the BACB supervision and coursework requirements. So in one of the very first modules, I told you about what your requirements are in terms of supervision. Your supervisor will be a board-certified behavior analyst, and you have a requirement in terms of how often you meet with that person, and the kind of activity that you engage in under that person's supervision, and it's your responsibility to maintain those standards. And then finally, you're discouraging the misrepresentation by non-certified individuals. What that means is that a person may claim, and I've certainly have seen this in my career, a person has claimed that they were a board-certified behavior analyst. You may have information that proves otherwise. I think one of the most egregious examples that I've ever encountered is that a person had falsified their certificate as a board-certified behavior analyst. They created a fabricated certificate number. They fabricated a certificate as well, and was representing themselves as a board-certified behavior analyst. However, they were not. And it was because of one person who stepped forward and said, I have information otherwise, that resulted in that person's discovery and resulted in that person's termination. And we reported that person to the Behavioral Certification Board as well as somebody that was a fraud. This will be the kind of thing that you may encounter, and one of our obligations is to ensure that we're reporting such fraudulent representation, and that we're encouraging and that you're discouraging misrepresentation by other individuals. Now, as we always do with our modules, I'll conclude with some questions and answers. The first one, with respect to interventions, what is one of your fundamental responsibilities? And the answer is committing yourself to the use of evidence-based practices. We've spent a lot of time discussing evidence-based practices, the definition of evidence-based practices, and you know that as a registered behavior technician, we are committed to such practices. The next question is, what are your responsibilities regarding copyrighted and trademarked materials, such as that used by the Behavioral Certification Board? The answer is that you cannot duplicate or disseminate without the explicit permission of the authors or the publishers. The next question is true and false. It's acceptable to solicit testimonials from the families you serve as a registered behavior technician? Of course, you know that the answer is false. The next question is that the name of the committee formed to review and approve research involving human subjects. That would be the Institutional Review Board. And then finally, what is your obligation to the Behavioral Certification Board? And the answer is to provide timely and accurate information. Thank you for attending and being attentive throughout this module. I'm very excited for all of you in terms of you being on your pathway to become a registered behavior technician, and I look forward to seeing you and presenting more information in the next module.